Yes.
How did you get started hosting the open mic?
How did I get started hosting? Well, I'm friends with Marianne Harrigfeld and Harry Harrigfeld, who own the Colony, and they wanted to have a spoken event, and they asked me if I would do it, and I said, okay. And we're coming up on our 2-year anniversary, so that's been every Monday night for 2 years. A few exceptions and a few substitutes, but I'd say I've done probably 48 out of the 52 weeks a year for 2 years. And it's up and down, you know, it's an open mic, so we have our good days and our less good days, but I think it's been a pretty successful series. It's been predominantly poetry, but I have had some prose evenings, and even I had a dance evening, I had a magician, had a whirling dervish. Beginning in the end of July, I'm going to start doing one of the Mondays a month will be a Phil's short attention span variety show. And that will be an eclectic evening of invited performers, readers, dancers, short theater, musicians, each doing about 5 to 10 minutes, maybe a little longer. And so that's I'm kind of moving one of the nights to that format. We'll see how my open mic regulars complain or don't complain, but hopefully we'll get a slightly different crowd too. I'm kind of excited about that. There'll be some sketch comedy, improv comedy, theater, in addition to some poets and dancers. I'm actually in rehearsal for one of the dance pieces that we're going to do this coming one, the first one. I got started because I wanted to see it happen, and I know in the past in Woodstock there had been a regular weekly reading, but when the Tinker Street Cafe closed, or they're soon about there, that ended. So I don't know. There's so many readers and fine poets in the area that it just called out for it. So I also wanted to hear a lot of them. You know, hear what other people were working on. You know, besides, I think that like a lot is gained by hearing other voices. As a writer, you gain a lot from hearing other writers. And you know, you take what you like, but you kind of, I have to say, I have to kind of roll with it. You know, I can't get too up when it's good and too down when it's not so good, because it's a whole, you know, there's a whole body of writers out there, and I think there's room for all of us. So it's kind of developed that way, where, you know, there's the spoken word people, there's the performance-oriented writers, there are the more academic-oriented poets, there's the people doing stuff spontaneous, you know, improving on the moment. So it's kind of, I've tried to really stress. I remember at one point different people have wanted it to be different things, but somebody had asked me, what do I mean by open? And I focused on open as sort of, in my mind, kind of the way I wanted to approach it, that it was available and open to whatever people brought. There's some problems associated with that. I'd like the level of work to kind of go upward and hear better work, but you can't control it, you know. So I just really kind of focused on keeping it open and being supportive of just anybody who's maybe never read before. I think at my reading, a lot of people have read who have never read at any other reading, which is a good thing, although sometimes the work is, you know, new, not yet mature, but that's okay. Yeah. Well, it's glad to be back, you know. It's all the way over there, and now I'm all the way over here. So that's how I got started. I just jumped in 2 feet. July 6th, 2001 was our first night.
And that seems to be a pretty conducive place for poetry.
The Colony Room is a wonderful place. I mean, it's got, its own history, although that's kind of obscure, but it does have its own history. But the room itself, the wood, I think it's a very inviting space. It's a good size room, and although it's a little tricky, getting the sound not to sound a little boomy, for the most part, I think people are heard fairly well there. If you want to be off the mic, as some poets like to read off the mic, they need to have large voices, because it is a fairly large room. But it's not impossible. A few poets that are somewhat regular read off the mic.
Is it true that you have a no melody rule?
Well, that's sort of none of the rules. I have a lot of rules that all of them are flexible. I mean, for the most part, I'd like people to keep it to 5 minutes. For the most part, I like to follow the list that people sign up in, the order that people sign up in. For the most part, I'd rather it be spoken or something not that what you would see at a singer-songwriter open mic. For the main reason being that there are plenty of those around, and they tend to inevitably be longer than 5 minutes. But it's not a hard rule. If somebody comes up with a guitar and they say, do you mind if I do a song? I say, okay, one song, I think that goes along with the attitude of it being open. I don't think a lot is gained by being very rigid, particularly in something like an open mic. I mean, there are some people who think that it should only be poetry, and to some extent it should only be serious poetry. First of all, it's too hard of a job to become the arbiter of some aesthetic, and it's not a job I want to entertain. It's too difficult. But at the same token, I just don't want to be rigid and be making foes and enemies because I say that's not serious or that's not a poem. What's a poem anyway? I think if the person brings integrity, then it becomes art, kind of regardless of what form it takes. Now, not that everybody brings integrity. I mean, we all can be self-indulgent, but it's not I don't want to be the person who's, deciding what's a serious, real poem. But some people have said that there is something gained when you have poet after poet after poet, and it creates sort of this, just a sort of a special space, and that maybe that's not happening because I'm a little flexible or allowing non-poets to read or something, or to present. And that may be true, but that's just kind of, it was a decision I made kind of early on, mainly because as soon as you decide what's okay to bring and what's not okay to bring, there's always the stuff in the gray area, and I don't want to be sitting there kind of, squirming to decide, And I like to be flexible because, sometimes I've had some very young people come up who want to read, but they got there late for the sign-up sheet. They'd end up be reading at 11 p.m. and they ask, can I read early? I think, yeah, why not? So they get by, and I've ruffled a few feathers by being a little lax of that. But I think over time, people have gotten the sense that the openness has been conducive to everybody, ultimately, I mean, I'd love it if more of the established, maybe published poets in the area came out with more regularity. I would like it, but it is what it is. I kind of just developed like kind of a roll with it attitude to it. And
have you ever had a train wreck?
oh, we've had train wrecks. I've had, scheduling features that like I usually have 2 features a night, and if both features are from out of town and it's a rough weather night, I've had, very small crowds. I felt badly because, people can be, before they get there, they're very excited about reading in Woodstock, whatever they think that may mean. Different people have different conceptions. And then they get there and there's, less than 10 people in the room. It's kind of, I think some sadness and connected to that. But, relatively, there have been a couple of, that hasn't happened in a while, and I think over time people have gotten a sense of just my being supportive of most anybody who has the courage to come up and share their art. But early on, some people brought attitude and there were some tense moments, but I try to keep a smile and kind of make it more just about supporting other people and hearing other people. There have been times when there's been people read and then don't want to listen, so they're up in the room making lots of noise, and that can be kind of, has to be addressed to some extent, but for the most part, it's kind of worked out. Train wrecks, I guess the worst train wreck is just people reading and not many people in the room, There have been some great nights, though. There have been nights I've had, 100 people in the room. So, it can be electric, too. So.
You have many first-time poets?
Yeah, I think we do. I think a lot of people have been encouraged by what I try to put out is just a supportive thing, thanking I try to make a point of thanking everybody who reads after they read and be very gracious. And I think that has won people to, because I remember the first time I ever read in public. I think it was actually at one of Sheaves' readings. And I remember how petrified I was. And that can be good in the sense that the fuel to, you wouldn't be afraid of something except for the fact that you're afraid of it is an indication of its importance to you. But it had blocked me for a long time, and Sheaves is, I think, similarly welcoming and supportive and gracious, and that was encouraging to me and helped me relax enough so that I could actually do it. And I think that, I think a lot of people, first-time readers, has been because I bring that sort of, gracious and thankfulness that they're sharing their art. So, like last Monday, we had 2 people who had never read in public before.
So you have a wide variety of poetry?
You mean at the readings? Yeah, they're. We've had performance, the various groups. Performance poetry, academic poets, freelance poets, political poets, romantic poets, language poets, prose poets, non-poets. We've had non-poet poets.
How did you get started with poetry?
Well, I always wrote growing up, not a whole lot, and certainly not in a poetry form. But I guess in college I took a creative writing course, and I took a poetry. Well, I guess it was actually a modern literature, which included some loose discussion of poetry. We read read Cummings and Williams and Yeats and Wallace Stevens and Walt Whitman. And it was really Cummings and William Carlos Williams that really were the first poets that I just sort of got. I mean, in a sense, and Shakespeare, I guess, some of Shakespeare's sonnets, where I relaxed a little bit in terms of, I think a lot of people approach poetry, like it's almost like a puzzle, and do I get it, and what is this saying, and I don't know, with Cummings and Williams, I was, particularly Cummings at first, able to sort of relax my mind a little bit and not press so hard to decipher, and just kind of get the emotional content. Whether it was with Cummings, it's often, to some extent, quirky, almost funny, even as he is poignant in places. And a few lines like no one, not even the rain, has such small fingers. That was a very seminal line for me. I may have even misquoted it, but I'm pretty sure that's a well-known line of Cummings. And there were a few singular lines that I went, oh wow. And then, so that was first, and then I had a creative writing course where, of course I ended up writing like a dozen Cummings-like poems, as I think every beginning poetry writer may do, because it's easier when you break in some sense it can be an easier format. And so I had poems that just went straight down the page, and I had actually a few of them I think are still worth kind of bringing out. I don't know if I remember any by heart. There was one about ground up and earth pull, hold on, I think I'm. And I kept having all these different ways of describing falling, but I never say the word falling. And that was one of the first poems I wrote. And I wrote this weird sort of prose poem, I guess. It was just this weird short little tale that was in that same course. And that was the only poem or the only piece that the professor of that class actually liked. Poor worried bald Mr. Berrysoon cast one last worried glance at the sky up above. And the title was That Evening at the Blank Arms Hotel. And it was just this, I don't even remember all of it, but it was this sort of weird sort of tale of a guy on the day of his own burial. In very oblique kind of, but there was something quirky and kind of interesting about it. It had a little mystery that kind of made it, I think, poetry makes nothing happen, I've heard it said. And maybe there was something that maybe in that moment, in that piece, where nothing happened. And so maybe that was my first real poem or something. And that was many years ago. That was when I was in college. And I always wrote a little bit, and I started, rebuked or refused love or refused adoring. Maybe love is too strong a word, but various situations where I was interested in someone and they did not respond. That's always good fuel for sitting and writing poems. So that there were a few specific ones of those that generated a whole flurry of poems. And one real relationship that ended about 8 years ago fueled a real intense amount of writing. And except for that class, I had never really shared any of the things I had written, not with friends or anybody. But about 6 or 7 years ago, I started sharing with a few writing friends of mine, and I got very encouraging feedback, and that sort of fueled some more. And and it kind of just started rolling intensely. About 4 years ago, I went to a writing conference for the first time, and I just suddenly gave myself permission to consider that, yeah, maybe, I could, maybe I'm a poet. Even though I had done a lot of things that I end up now doing kind of regularly, I never really thought of myself as, I don't want to, it sounds pretentious. I try to not be pretentious about it, but to think of myself as a poet. And being at a writing conference amongst people who were either serious about writing or even successful at writing gave me a lot of, and then getting positive feedback about the work that I was bringing, it just really fueled giving myself a lot of, giving myself the critical permission. For me, it was always about it being okay to write. Perhaps because my father's a writer, and I had never had gotten a lot of encouragement in that direction, because I was a math major, and I was really more, and I did, application programming for a living. So my whole sort of, at least public persona was really directed in being a technically inclined person, and that stuff that came to me pretty well, but it kind of maybe stuck the artistic stuff to the side, and so it became it was a big move for me to give myself permission to consider myself an artist, and that occurred in writing, and that also occurred in theater, and starting to do a lot of acting and exploring that side too. So it was progressive, but there were significant moments. The college experience. There was some. I remember a junior high school English teacher I had. She was kind of a hippie woman, and we studied some Simon and Garfunkel, Paul Simon tunes as poems, some Bob Dylan tunes as poems, some early 60s anti-war songs as poems, Eve of Destruction, some of these sort of classic anti-war songs, folk songs, but we read them as poems, and that was an early poetry experience. I mean, besides, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, and some of the stuff you get exposed to. But there were these, even though it was sort of a progression, there were significant moments. So. And now, right here on our stage. Maybe. Well, you know a lot of my work. What would you like to hear?
Well, didn't you do something about knots? I thought that was sort of interesting.
Knots?
Yes. About someone hanging.
There was a poem. There was a poem called, which I have to say, I don't think that poem's done. A poem called "Climbing Around the Middle" that has the line, "I can do the hanged man's twitch. Right. I can do the lover's tangle." But that poem's not done. They're never done, but that one's particularly not done. But I like that poem. A lot of poems, I think, at least for me, a lot of poems it's a distilling process. I'm very interested in sort of a focusing down of maybe an experience I've had, or a particular moment that captures some essential sort of quality, or has in it some essential sort of quality. And I'm very interested in kind of paring away things that are not specific. So a lot of my poems can end up being very simple in a way. And that poem, I have a conception about what is the essential quality that I'm trying to convey, and I don't think I have it yet, so I would have to say that one's not done. That being said, I probably would say all of them are never done. I mean, poems stay alive, and every time I read a poem, I probably find a few words that I'd like to change, and maybe find one word that I actually do change. So, as an example, maybe of a pared down quality one, and maybe this is a little bit of an ars poetica. It kind of, I thought of it as a poem that maybe captured what's of kind of a certain essential interest to me, and ars poetica as in a poem written, or a piece of art written or created about the process of making art. So I'll read this one maybe. It's called "The Boy Finds the Small Things." The boy finds the small things and puts them in the right place. Here he places a pear, here a ripe rose. In his shoe he finds a pebble, he returns it to the wood. He retrieves the discarded penny, from the date he knows its nature. Pennies before '82 are wholly copper, after sandwiched tin. He feels in his small way he is helping. The boy finds the paper clip curious. Should it be placed alone, or is it meant to hold a place for something else? A photo, an old note, a few words. In his room, he removes everything from his bag. One by one, his bag is emptied. He is ready to see the world. He hears that in town there is a lost and found. He will go. Returning, his bag again full, he clears an area. He pauses over every object, considers, and pauses again. These things take time, like climbing carefully or falling far without fear. The single mitten, the only sock. So that's, thank you, Glenn.
Very nice.
Very nice. This was I guess 2 years ago. Oh, 2 years ago? When did I first make this? No, last year. Yeah, last year I was an invited reader at the Woodstock Poetry Festival. And about a week before my reading, I said, I should have a chapbook. So that's what led to this. This one's my dog-eared personal copy. And I went through 50 of them, selling almost half. You know, when you host a poetry, when you host a poetry event, the open mic, you become friends with lots of poets, so you're always trading chapbooks. And so a lot of them ended up in people's hands, you know, freely. But I sold about 25 of the first printing. I printed 50. And now I'm about halfway through the second printing, which had some changes. I revised a few poems, and I made up another 100, and I'm about halfway through those. So 13 poems as of, available at Golden Notebook.
Does publishing make you look at your work differently?
Well, I haven't really published. I haven't even really submitted that much. I have published in a few local journals. Sheev has a Wildflowers. I have one poem in one of his, I think the first or second? The first issue. And I've published in a local journal of short fiction, although he bent the rule. The piece that I included in there was really more like a poem, even though it didn't have the line breaks that typically come with poems. That was in Brent Robertson's Prima Materia. And I published in Chronogram and a couple of online zines. But for the most part, I haven't even actually submitted. And one of the issues being, and it's sort of a stickling thing, but my name being, you know, the name of a very well-known American poet, Phillip Livine. That's my name also. And though I spell it with 2 L's, and though I've been using my middle initial, it's inevitably comes up when in poetry circles. So that has, to some extent, been a little bit of a barrier. In fact, when the first Woodstock Poetry Festival, that was, I guess, 2 years ago, Billy Collins, I had my name tag because I was doing volunteer work. Billy Collins, looked at my name tag, and the first thing he said was, "Are you a poet?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he says, "Too bad." It was like, and we had this whole discussion about, well, maybe, do you want to change your name? This was Billy Collins, and he suggested, and my middle initial, and I was sort of resistant to using my middle initial. I don't know why, maybe for one reason or other. So he said, which is P, my natural middle initial is P, and Billy Collins is looking, and L, Phillip L. Livine, and I'm Poet Laureate of the United States. I can name you, submit as Phillip L. Livine. And I went away somewhat fueled, but then I don't know, I lost my stuff, so I haven't submitted, even though. Now I'm thinking, I just recently became the poetry editor for Chronogram, and I decided with Chronogram to use Phil Livine. And so maybe I'll use Phil Livine as when I start submitting, which I've been really gearing up towards, maybe I'll submit as Phil Livine so that there's no confusion that I'm not this Pulitzer Prize winner. I met Philip Livine, the Pulitzer Prize winning, I guess he won it in '95, at a local reading. And actually he's going to be here during this coming poetry festival. But I met him, actually I heard him read years ago in college, but then I met him, it was about a year and a half ago. He read at a local community college. And I introduced myself and I said, "Hi, my name's Philip Livine." And he was very nice and gracious, but he wasn't ready to change his name. So that's been a little, I don't know, maybe I've used it as an excuse, but I haven't done much in the way of, submitting, making an effort to publish. I mean, I put this chapbook together, and that's been almost the full extent of my publishing.
What was that poem you did where you were saying something about you put doors that didn't open, you had a box that...
Yes, Carpentry and Gardening. That was an apology poem. I had started to become involved with a woman, and then I guess mutually, but ultimately mutually, but initially it was kind of, I guess I reached the conclusion that I didn't want the relationship to go in that direction. So it was a poem to sort of explain myself and the mistakes I make in romantic domains. And so that was the fuel for that poem. And I could read that. It's called Carpentry and Gardening. I have broken hearts through the careless use of lilac and hammer, pounded salt like nails into the thinnest wounds and split the wood. I have twisted the root back upon itself to knot and choke, left the splinters of fine things in my fingers to pus and swell, breathed the dust of the dowel cut and rabbit run. I have let the sawtooth rust in the rain, buried flower beds in yards of mud, and for many seasons seen only the crack of grass between the rock. I have built crooked stairs that climb to empty places, hung doors where windows go, and placed clear glass in entry paths. I have picked the peach hard like nut. I have cut the stem before the bloom and scent. I have ripped the headboard ragged. Still, I have both hands and all my fingers, and I can still feel the raised grain of moistened wood, and smell the wild queen's lace, and see the tulips glow. And now I have made this plain and simple flower box of clean straight edge, rich in soil and well drained with stone. This plot is ready for seed, sun, and water.
That's one of my favorites.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. Thanks a lot. Yeah, that was one that, for the most part, spilled out, one morning. I think many of these, there's like a specific moment that a lot of them spill out, and then there's the process of kind of, thinking on it, letting it grow a little bit, trimming off the parts that don't fit or seem to clunk, and
you do a lot of rewriting. Oh
yeah, it's always revised, and that's why this title is 13 Poems As Of, because I don't want to sound apologetic, but these poems are always sort of moving, and so these are as of, like the time I made the chapbook, and in fact, the first printing and the second printing for the poems changed, some minor, but that one actually had the line, I have picked the peach hard like nut. That line wasn't even in the first one. I just had an experience actually of I have a peach tree and how different the fruit the peach is, before it's ripe. In taste and in how hard they are until they actually ripen. And so it was just another example of the real brutal mistakes I have made. And it looks like you've made them too. I think we all have made mistakes.
That's my favorite poetry, and ones about mistakes.
Yeah, well.
Sort of gives them a
here, I'll read another one that's about mistakes.
Graceful quality, right?
Yeah, or asking for grace at least. Here, this is let's see, yeah. This is the one that was published in Prima Materia, and it's also it's kind of a prose poem. You see, it's no line breaks at least. And it's called Soon. Soon. The day is light, and the day is long and has many rooms between the hours. The day also travels a long arc up, and then back down again from middle. And a calculus can count the length and width and area beneath this curve and tell us this place is large and has room for many things, many that we know and many more still. There is a room for joy with her large funny hat that bounces as she bounces, with laughter or something like it. And sadness too can have a room, she who likes to sleep, to take naps in the afternoon between top and shadow. And today is also a place I know and go to as if returning, and so I know there is a point or place or time for you and me along this curve of day, a place by the fire where we can burn all our old stories of loss and failure and warm our feet while we do it, because this fire is warm and soothes, and this fire is also hot and dances, and I see it in your eyes, and I know it is in mine. And by this fire I can watch your fingers curl and uncurl and think perhaps they wish to touch. And I can feel mine curl and uncurl too, even as I think to hold them still. But they will not, as they have 10 hearts and minds and desires of their own and wish to find their mates in yours. So 1 by 1 to 5, then 10, they arch across the spaces there between us, that is, the spaces between mine and yours and all that could be ours, like your 10 with their 10, their hearts and minds and desires, and all the same as all of mine, and all that dances there in the light of this fire. And soon, together 10 and 10 close and open and close together again. And soon beads of moisture gather there in their folding, and glistening collect the light. Then I risk to think they will be sweet when tasted, but it is to be waited for like dessert. For is not waiting the sweetest taste of all? For what is it but anticipation that brings a mouth to water, that brings the tongue to swelling, that purses lips and opens eyes to wide and wider still? So I am feasting in this waiting, and if we share this waiting, then so we share a feasting, and in this way a feast is made. And by this my heart is quickened, and soon it also pauses, and soon again quickens, and soon again pauses, and soon this hardens, and soon this softens, and soon between the beating and between the pausing, and between the hard and between the soft, soon there would be touching, yes soon there will be touching, yes soon there will be touched, and soon I will, yes soon you will, yes soon we will, yes soon, soon, soon.
And you passed that off as prose?
He did. Well, I guess, he liked it. Brent Robertson was very encouraging and encouraged me actually to submit it. That was in he's now actually looking for submissions for his third journal, where he's opened it up to poetry, just out and out said it's okay. He's looking for, Hudson Valley writers, but this issue, which is this journal, this volume, I should say, oriented towards narrative. So, but he says any written form is acceptable along the lines of narrative, short narrative.
So, do you find that hosting an open mic, has that changed your own poetry significantly in any way?
Well, certainly, I think, you gain a lot by hearing other poets and hearing other work, whether it's reading or hearing. I mean, poetry is, I don't want to say which side of this fence I am, but it certainly includes it being a spoken art form. So hearing poets, and hearing poems is, I think, it's good for any poet. But likewise, I think reading is a good thing too, reading other poets. So yeah, definitely. And it gets you, thinking. I mean, there's certainly a lot of poems that I have written over the last 2 years that were fueled or at least sparked by something I heard, a line that that just really rang out for me, startled me, which is my highest praise, I think. When something startles me, I'm always very, very interested in the startling phrase, is familiar in one sense, like it resonates with you, you know exactly what they're talking about, but it's said in sort of a strong way, with maybe by virtue of its sound or its, God, I never thought of that with that. Striking metaphor, striking alliteration, sound and if metaphor is sort of a way of explaining without explaining, those are the things that I really get jazzed by. And when that happens, when somebody comes along and does something like that, it can both specifically perhaps fuel an idea for a new poem, or just, become, God, it was so great hearing all that good stuff. I'm going to get back to working on that other thing. I mean, I don't typically have a lot of problem motivating myself to write, but it's to what earnest edge we do it is always to some, varies in some degree, and so it sometimes raises the stakes. Over the last 6 months or so, or even a year, the number of theater things I've been doing has been more the factor than any lack of interest.
Hi, Phillip.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks for having me in your beautiful place.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
Uh-huh.
It's fun for us to have this happening here.
Uh-huh. Have you told them that we're right by the Hudson River, and have you told our viewers that we're right by the Hudson River?
No,
Quite a
you
bit.
can tell.
We're right by the Hudson River. It's a beautiful spot. You can look out the window and see the Hudson. We're, I guess, about 40 miles south of Albany, right near Kingston, New York.
Great.
It's kind of a gray day, though. I've had a lot of gray days recently.
Sometimes you hear both.
I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead with your first
Member
question.
what?
A party that would have me as a member.
Oh, me either. Okay, so let's see here. What are you seeking when you are writing a poem?
I think there's a... Well, one thing that fueled me in specifically addressing that was this quote of Martha Graham's. It's like a letter I think she wrote to Agnes DeMille, and it was just a sort of, I guess Agnes DeMille was getting discouraged or whatever. And she had the phrase, queer, divine dissatisfaction. There's sort of a moment when maybe you have a little riff in a poem or something you feel, it may not be finished, but it's sort of like it has like a world in there. And there's something really like divinity where you've kind of gotten out of the way and you've received it and it's kind of come through you. And that's the divine part of it, that's the sort of, but it's to some extent beyond words, ineffable, shimmers, queer, the word that Martha Graham had. And to some extent, it's, you get that moment. We get moments. I think that's all we get is moments. And so there's the dissatisfaction because, you get that moment, oh, wow, that's really great. And what about, and it's only one moment. And then, and then it's, so I think that there's nothing like that feeling. It's great. It's a wonderful feeling when you have a riff, you come up with a line that just feels, whether the sound or and you just want to share it, and there's that great feeling, and then there's the next moment. It's sort of like breathing, So poem, so that's sort of in a general sense what, and then I think what I was saying to Glenn, a lot of my poems are sort of trying to capture some sort of essential aspect. Like that piece Soon was kind of, I had just been rejected by someone who said we'll get together soon, and I just knew that was never going to happen. And it was really just sort of that, trying to capture that sort of yearning thing that I think we all do at certain points, even when we know it's not going to happen soon. It's not going to happen ever. So any specific poem is, for me, is to some extent is an effort of mine to, not necessarily explicate or tell, but to show some essential sort of thing. That's of interest to me. So my poems tend to kind of distill something. That's just the way they've kind of been going. I don't know. I'm not to say that that's the right way to write poetry or what should a poem should do, but that's just what for me has been. So Carpentry and Gardening was sort of like explaining how I've really messed up a lot of relationships or building projects or gardens. And The Boy Finds the Small Things was sort of about that whole thing of distilling. It was a poem about making poetry, and Soon was about this anticipation, yearning. And it was also, soon also was just about like, when you wake up in the morning, the day could be anything, and you could have this part of the day and you can divide the day up like the calculus, you can slice it smaller and smaller to create, this is my math background, but the way they discovered the calculus, Leibniz and Riemann, they have a curve and they make these rectangles, and then you make smaller rectangles, and this whole process of limiting. And I thought of these as like rooms, and they're sort of like, slices of my day. I'm going to spend 5 minutes thinking about that movie, and 3 minutes thinking about that woman, and 2 minutes thinking about next year plans. And so there was that sort of, and in that sort of, and one of the rooms was the yearning room. Soon, maybe we'll have that moment, her and I. Knowing we wouldn't, but so, I don't know. So generally it's about kind of trying to get those exciting moments, those moments of creating. I think Bob Dylan said, he didn't write any of them. They were floating around in the blue and bonked them on the head, And that's sort of when you get onto something and when something feels right, that's how it feels. It feels like, what you really did was just get out of the way. I think that's kind of, our job is not to be like the accountant in the basement saying whether it's good or not to be the critic, because all of that just that really kind of just gets in the way. The job is to kind of get out of the way, and when you get out of the way, you get those moments, and so that's kind of, I guess. And there's nothing better, really. Well, maybe there's a few things better, or as good. But, so that's kind of what it's, and similarly, like in performance, in theater, or like I have some pieces that are more performance-oriented pieces, and there's moments where you feel like you presented the poem or the piece or the theater, the role, like in that magical way where you were at one with the character, or you were at one with the words, and you get these sort of just thrilling moments of just being so clear and so, no separation between what you're doing and who you are doing it, and that's I think, that's the moment, those are the moments.
It's beautiful.
Huh.
So,
Sometimes it's ugly, sometimes it's dreadfully ugly.
in what way?
Well, because we fail too, And I think there's, it's very much about the moments, because moments are in their nature like these instants. It's a very Zen kind of thing, as soon as you sort of observe and try to hold on to it, you kill it, you suffocate it, and the mind is a very dangerous beast, and a very, the mind is a terrible thing. And the nature of consciousness just sort of wants to, the nature of language is to limit things. And so those instants, as soon as we sort of hold on to them, they become like, the crushed flower, and so, the issue of being prideful or kind of taking ownership. It's like taking ownership but letting go. It's like I think that's kind of the critical razor's edge. Like, be fully with it, but not sort of think it's yours. And so it gets ugly when you come from need, or you need the praise. But there's nothing wrong with feeling joy from the acknowledgement. So it's a very ticklish curve, when you can't write thinking, I'm writing this because I want people to like it. That's just a layer that gets in the way. But when you write something and it kind of sings out, you just know people are going to respond to it. So it's very, so there's the ugliness and the beauty, like kind of right right on either side of the coin.